All right, let me just check this one thing out and then we should be all set. All right, that's having a little bit of an issue, but I will deal with that later. Okay, let me get my slides up. All right, well, good morning. Thanks for coming out on the last day of PASS. I know your brains are probably full. My name is Allan Hirt, and for roughly the next 75 minutes, I'm going to be talking to you about cluster quorum. Now, this is a Windows-based topic that relates to SQL Server, so just a heads up on that, there's going to be a lot of Windows-y kind of talk, because there's no way to talk about quorum without it. So things you've been seeing all week, be respectful of everyone else, just please silence your cell phones. Yeah, you've seen this. Would appreciate it, just from my standpoint, if at the end of the session you do an evaluation. And please, if you're going to ding me, more than happy to take the ding. Just please provide constructive criticism. And by the way, hello to everyone else out there on PASS TV. So what I'm going to cover over the next hour plus, I'm going to do a basic level setting of what quorum actually is. I'm also going to talk to you about multi-site architectures in quorum. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what forcing quorum is, and then finally I'm going to wrap things up. And again, just the warning there that this is a SQL session, but because it's dealing with clusters, there's going to be a lot of Windows talk, so if this is something that you're not comfortable with, now's a really good time to pull the escape chute. All right, so before I go anywhere, I want to level set on some terminology and some acronyms that I'm going to be using during this talk. First and foremost, when I talk about a Windows failover cluster, it's a WSFC. That's your Windows level clustering. A node is a server that participates in the Windows failover cluster. The cluster has something called a database. The database of the cluster is not what we think of in the traditional SQL Server terms. It's just its configuration information. That little picture there shows you what it actually looks like. An FCI is a clustered instance of SQL Server. So that's the traditional form of clustering that we think of when we implement a SQL Server. And AG is an availability group. And because both of these features will be impacted by quorum, I'll be discussing both of them. All right. Another basic thing that you've probably ascertained by now, but it's going to be drilled into your heads if you didn't know this by the end of the session, both availability groups and FCIs utilize and are built on top of a Windows Server failover cluster. So even though AGs are database level protection, they are built on a Windows cluster, so you can't configure an AG without clustering Windows first. There are a lot of things that come along with that. I talked about that in my pre-con on Tuesday. So this isn't a what's an AG session. I'm just making sure that you understand that things that you do in Windows now affect something that is largely a database-related feature. Now, things from my perspective that hurt an availability of your Windows failover cluster, which in turn could hurt the availability of your SQL Server. Obviously, losing a site or something like a node of the cluster, obviously. One of the biggest things that you can do, and you'll see throughout this talk how this impacts it, but networking is really important to maintaining quorum. Doing things like adding evicting nodes, that's going to affect certain things like votes, and we're going to talk about what votes are. Doing things like reboots. I'll give you an example where I had a customer that rebooted nodes and they had a problem with quorum. And if you lose things like the witness, and again, we'll talk about what the witness is. But even more fundamental than that, why do you actually need to worry about quorum as a DBA? Because, well, if you're a DBA, clustering is the Windows guy's problem, right? Wrong. If your cluster's not up, SQL Server's not up. It's really that simple. So if you're not monitoring and maintaining where you're at with quorum, even if it's technically not your responsibility, then you're going to have some issues. So there are a couple things related to quorum. The type of quorum that you may have implemented is called a quorum model. And we're going to talk about what those are in just a little bit. And depending on the quorum model, it may or may not contain the cluster database. So again, that's one of those things that you need to think about here as you'll go through this deck, and you'll see where that impacts. There's a condition called split brain, which I'm going to show you at the end of this session. It's something that you should worry about, but not something that you shouldn't insanely worry about, and you'll see why. And again, bottom line, if you lose quorum, that will take the Windows cluster down, which will in turn take down your FCI or your availability group. This is why this is all so important, because in a clustered ecosystem, it's tightly coupled. It's not loosely coupled. Okay, so let's have a look of what this means on SQL Server. I'm going to show you two examples here. And I know you can't see my screen yet, because when I'm in presenter mode, you got to switch. Now, of course, in the Murphy's Law of demos, some of my demos, I tested them last night. I even tested them in the hotel room this morning. One of them is deciding not to work with me, and it's luckily one of the later ones. But it is what it is. So first of all, I'm going to show you this. So I've got 3 standalone instances of SQL Server. So I'm going to zoom in here. Give me a second. Come on, zoom it. Oh, is it not in this? Okay. Let me zoom it in here. Hold on one second. Thought it was in this, but I had to switch drives. That was part of my issue this morning. So I'm going to a slightly older version of my demos, but that's okay. So let's do zoom it. All right. So now getting back to this, if we look here, is HADR enabled means that availability groups, the feature itself, is enabled to work on my instance of SQL Server. All right. And in this instance of SQL Server, or I should say in these instances, I've got some availability groups. But wait, what's going on? They all say resolving. That means they're not in a good, happy place. And your AGs are basically down. Now, at this point, if your AGs are down, you're going to have to possibly look at the cluster or other stuff that's going on to see what's happening. Well, if I go over to Failover Cluster Manager, which is already open, you will see, lo and behold, that my cluster is down. So even though I have standalone instances of SQL Server, and you see that by is clustered equals false, meaning that these are standalone, I can see my system databases. I can see this AGDB3, for example, which isn't part of an availability group. It's just a database. It's still up. But any database that's in an availability group is down. But again, this is a new phenomenon that got introduced with SQL Server 2012 because with an AG, as you can see, you can build them on standalone instances of SQL Server. So you can connect to your instance, the server's up, that seems fine, but because your cluster is down, so too are your databases participating in the AG. Now let's compare this to the clustered instance scenario, and I'm actually going to show you something a bit older here. I'm going to show you Windows Server 2003. Now this one I couldn't really make bigger. I tried getting Zoom It to run. But basically I've got a single standalone instance, clustered instance of SQL Server 2005. And the reason I'm showing you Windows Server 2003 is that the core models were slightly different in this version, and I'm going to explain to you why what they did here is no longer what you should be doing. So I have 2 nodes. I have Bach and I have Beethoven. My clustered instance name is Concerto. So let's just connect to it just to show you. So I'm into my clustered instance, if it ever comes up. Yeah, there we go. So it's up. Okay, now at this point, if I'm looking at quorum, and again, 2003 was quite different, you'll see I'm using a quorum disk. So those of you that are familiar with quorum to some degree know that historically when we did clustered instances of SQL, you have something called the quorum disk. And through Windows Server 2003, if you use a disk, the disk was actually quorum itself. So if you lost this disk, you basically lost your cluster. And that's exactly what I'm going to show you. Your disk at that point is a single point of failure. Because I'm using iSCSI, I'm going to basically now go in and kill that disk. Sure. So I'm going to go to my iSCSI server, and then we'll see the downstream effect on the FCI. Now, in sharp contrast to the other one where I showed you the availability groups in the standalone scenario, when the cluster goes down here, you actually lose your FCI as well. It goes down. So unlike the AG standalone scenario that I just showed you, where you might have other databases not participating in AG, and if you can get to the instance, it's still up, here you essentially lose everything. So let me file and storage services, iSCSI, and basically what I'm just going to do is really simple. I'm going to go in here, here's quorum for this, and I'm going to disable this disk. So it should take a minute or so, and this will eventually go down. So give it a second. Let me actually do another thing to forcefully kill it. The other thing about this too, in this case, is once you lose that, and then you say lose a node, things are going to go down. So this is being a little slow to fail. Come on, you can fail. All right, we'll come back because it hasn't caught it yet. I'll show you this failure in a minute. But bottom line is, if you lose in this scenario the quorum disk, things do massively go offline. And that was really bad. So what they did in Windows Server 2008, they recoded things. So the way things work in Windows Server 2008 and later is that bottom line here is that it is based on voters. Every node gets a vote by default, and if you're using what's called a witness resource, it gets a vote. That behavior changes a little bit in Windows Server 2012 R2, and I'll talk about that. So think of a legislature. If you have enough votes, something passes. In this case, if you have enough votes, your cluster is up. If you don't have enough votes, your cluster is down. So in the case of this, a big part of that is making sure that the nodes can talk to each other. This is why we need redundant communication, because for it to know that another node is up, the cluster needs to be able to see all the other nodes. So if you have really bad networking or not redundant paths and you lose your single path, things go down. And unlike Windows Server 2000 and Windows Server 2003, if you're just using a disk-only quorum, it's bad, because the concept of what they introduced in, and I'll talk about on the next slide, is the witness. The witness basically is just another resource in the cluster that adds to the vote. Now, the other thing that comes up, especially with availability groups, is that with a hotfix in Windows Server 2008 and 2008 R2 and built into 2012 and 2012 R2, you have the ability to remove a vote from a node. That affects the overall number that counts against your quorum. So in the case of, let's say, a 3-node Windows Server failover cluster that you have as an AG configuration, let's say it's 2 nodes are synchronous for availability, and then you have a third node that's purely for reporting. If that third node you don't care about from an availability perspective, you could potentially remove its vote. And I'll show you how to do that in a little bit. But the thing is, when it comes to votes, how many things you can lose, it does depend on your operating system. So through Windows Server 2012, you could lose simultaneously up to 49%. They made a big change with a few features in Windows Server 2012 R2 that you could lose up to simultaneously 50%. So in the case where you would have 4 nodes and all would have votes, in that case, you could lose 2 of them at the same time and still be up and running. That's a big change in Windows Server 2012 R2, and that is one of the reasons that when I'm at clients, I recommend that they use Windows Server 2012 R2 as their operating system. There are other reasons, but that's one of the major ones. So what are actually the quorum models? As I put on a couple slides and talked about, the disk-only one is one that you should never use because it's a single point of failure. And I actually saw it this year twice at customers because they're hanging on to the old precepts of Windows 2000 Server and Windows Server 2003 that, oh, I need a disk. That's not always true. Yes, question. Could you actually, if you're going to use the question, please use one of the microphones so everyone can hear it? Thank you.
Hi, thanks. I've read your books for years, by the way, and I really wanted to come to this course.
Thanks.
So I have a client that is using this model on a Windows 2008 R2 cluster. It's a geo cluster.
Yep.
They have the quorum disk clustered, and the reason they want to do this is because they can lose all but one node. Performance will be horrendous, but the cluster and the applications will not go down. Then they can go in and they can start shutting down applications, but they still have one node. So in the past, we have had the quorum disk fail on a node at the main site and fail over to another node. The cluster will dissolve, but then it reforms itself automatically when it comes up on another node, and that node would just be down. And also, it can fail over to the DR site and still keep your cluster up. So when I see that, I've been having a running thing with this customer for well over a year on this, and with Microsoft, and please qualify that or explain the do not use ever, and could it be a good
because that, all right, so capping the question is basically she has a client that's still using disk only because she has a multi-subnet. Now I'm going to be talking about multi-site in a little bit, so I'm going to capture this just a touch. But the thing is, as I said, disk-only quorum is literally a single point of failure. So if that disk goes down, then your entire cluster goes down. That's not the situation you want. One of the reasons I was just getting into on this slide is that by default, the model that they use in Windows Server 2008 and later is called node majority plus witness. Now let me explain, let me go a little bit back here. In Windows Server 2003, they introduced a new quorum model called majority node set, where basically the nodes themselves were essentially voters, but they weren't called that at the time, and that they essentially established quorum. But really that was good if you had, say, a geographically dispersed site, or you had an odd number of nodes. But it didn't take care of all situations, and in the case of SQL at that time, we only had FCIs. So we had traditional shared disk, we didn't have a lot of other stuff, so having a disk at that time for SQL made a lot of sense. But with it being a single point of failure, when they moved to Windows Server 2008 and changed a lot of things within Windows failover clustering, basically they said, we need something like node majority all the time, where the nodes themselves can make sure that the cluster is up. But if we have, let's say, an even number of nodes, we need something else to keep everything odd. So that's another key takeaway here, is that you should always keep things odd in terms of the voters for a Windows failover cluster. So that's where the concept of a witness comes in. Now, a witness can either be a file share or a disk. So that in this case, so let's say you have a 4-node cluster. You could have a disk witness or a file share witness. It essentially doesn't matter, and I'll talk about the scenarios which you would use either. But that keeps you odd, and you have another voter in the mix, right? So now in the case where you have a geographically replicated disk, again, if that disk is a single point of failure, so if you lose your SAN, your entire cluster is going offline. But if you're totally switching sites, there are other things that you can do in this new model with node majority plus witness, where they may not have to reconfigure anything else or slightly reconfigure something, gives them a more supported effect. And we'll talk about how things have changed in a little bit. So if I don't answer it a little bit later when I get to the multi-subnet, come to me afterwards and we'll go walk through it. But they did change things because the thing is, node majority plus witness is much more resilient than just a disk-only quorum. And that's the big thing here, because if you don't have anything that's resilient and it brings your cluster down and you don't know about it, that's a problem. Another thing they introduced, which, by the way, if you're using Windows Server 2012 or later, would be impacted if you use disk-only quorum, since it wouldn't work with it. It basically overrides it, is something called dynamic quorum. Now, what dynamic quorum is really simple. Let's say, outside of assigning it a vote, let's assume at this point everything in your cluster has a vote. For whatever reason, a node goes down. That node is taken out of voting contention, even if it was assigned a vote. And the cluster automatically recalculates the total number. So let's say you went down, you had 3 nodes, you lost a node for whatever reason, then the cluster would say, oh, hey, I've got 2 voting things. But what it doesn't do at this point is you went from odd to even. So at this point, it's not going to automatically roll in a witness resource for you. You're going to have to manually deal with that, much in the same way that you would have to manually deal with that in Windows Server 2008 R2 if you lost a node. The difference here is that if you're using Windows Server 2008 or Windows Server 2008 R2 for your SQL Server, if you lost that node, that 3rd node would still have a vote. So by losing one more node in this case, or something else that would take the cluster down, your entire cluster goes down, whereas in the case of dynamic quorum, and I'll do a little bit of a demo of dynamic quorum in a bit, things could stay up much easier. Because really where Microsoft is going with quorum at the Windows level is they want you to be set and forget. They want you to not have to worry about quorum. Now they take this further in Windows Server 2012 R2. Again, another reason that I recommend Windows Server 2012 R2. In addition to dynamic quorum, there's dynamic witness. So in that case where we went from 3 to 2 nodes that I just talked about, if you configure a witness, it will either roll in or roll out the witness automatically for you. So let's say you have a 3-node AG configuration with standalone. You have it configure a file share witness. And with 3, you're odd. So at that point, the cluster is not going to have a witness. You lose a node, it's going to go down to 2. It says, oh, I'm even. I see you've configured a witness, I'm going to roll it in. So then your votes automatically go back up to 3. So again, you're not managing this anymore. The cluster is managing it for you. This doesn't quite always work in multi-subnet, multi-site scenarios, because for me, quite frankly, when you're doing things like switching sites, that is a manual process. You don't want to automatically fail between sites because if you think about a disaster recovery drill, when your site A goes down, there's a lot of other things that generally need to be up and running or verified that are up and running before you even bring SQL Server up. Because if you bring SQL Server up in a bad state, everything else is going to topple from there. You know, for example, you need to make sure you may have domain connectivity or network connectivity, any number of things. And we'll talk a little bit later when we get into the multi-subnet stuff. Another thing in Windows 2012 that they introduced is something called the tiebreaker. And I'm going to demonstrate that for you as well, where basically there is a property that's dynamic by default. You can actually choose the node that you want to be the tiebreaker. But basically this thing says, okay, if I get into a scenario where I am, let's say, multi-subnet, but this also does work in same subnet, but I want my main site, site A, to be the one that remains up, I'm going to basically pick a node in the other site and say, okay, if I need to take a vote away, it's going to be in the other node or the other site instead of in my primary site. And again, I'll show you where that is. Could you please ask any questions in the mic, please? Thank you.
All right. So about dynamic witness, do you pick, like out of a pool of resources, what is considered a witness resource, or how does it work? Do you have them lined up, and if one fails, then go to the next, or?
I'm going to demonstrate that in just a minute, so give me 1 minute on that. Okay, so one of the things, and I think the deck is up there now, but if it's not, I'll make sure it's up there later, and the reason for that is I was basically under embargo not to talk about the fourth column over there for about a month. And that's cloud witness. But there are basically 3 witness types now. There's disk, obviously, there's file share witness, and there's what's known now as cloud witness, which is coming in the next version of Windows. So what's the difference between them? Disk is essentially, obviously, locally attached through storage in some way. So if you're doing traditional FCIs with shared storage, pretty good model to use. It contains the cluster database. So in that case, whatever node has it will always have the latest copy of the cluster database. In comparison, the file share is just that. You can connect to a file share, has to have the right permissions, but it doesn't contain a copy of the cluster database. So what that could result in is if the cluster, let's say the cluster goes down and you need to bring it up, and the node that you choose to bring up doesn't have the latest copy of the cluster database, that's a condition called partition in time. And it won't allow you to bring up the cluster because you have a partition in time. So while it could help in the case of partition in time, it won't solve it. Only having the latest copy of the cluster database will. Now, the cloud witness is very similar to file share witness, except it's mainly was put in for multi-site configuration. And I have pictures later to show you what that looks like. It's one of the things actually I didn't get into my pre-con on Tuesday because we ran out a little bit of time. But basically, one of the issues with multi-site configurations is where do you stick the witness? Because if you stick it on one side, there are some issues there. If you stick it on the other side, there are some issues there. So you want it essentially in some neutral third whatever. Not everybody is the third data center. So assuming your nodes have internet connectivity, you can now create a witness up in Azure. Now this is blob storage. This is not actually a VM. This is not like needing to use a site-to-site VPN. It's just a blob that gets created up in Azure. Very low usage, very low network bandwidth, so in terms of cost, it'll be very low in general. So what that actually looks like is this. So let me zoom in on this just a touch. So you'll see a resource called the Cloud Witness. You'll see they actually put a little cloud picture next to it. So one of the things, recommendation I'm going to tell you now is if you're looking at doing multi-site, say, AG configurations, or doing hybrid scenarios where you're, say, partially on-prem and partially in the cloud, I'd start evaluating the new Windows Server technical preview and looking at things like Cloud Witness, because it provides you that independent thing outside of the cluster that you don't have to manage. Now, from a storage perspective, here's what it looks like. So if we look at, this is a free tool that you can get. It's on Codeplex, I believe it is. It's called Azure Storage Explorer. But if you go up and look, you'll see that it basically creates a folder within your blob storage called the Cloud Witness, and then the individual GUID that goes along with your cluster. And you can use this for multiple clusters. It's not one thing for everything. If you had 10 clusters, you could use the same storage. But bottom line here, it's brand new, coming in the next version of Windows. And like I said, I was not allowed to talk about it basically until about last week. So it was literally just something that rolled off the presses. So for SQL Server, what traditionally do I recommend before I get into any demos? Number one, if you have a standard 2-node FCI type scenario, like most people do, just use a disk. Seriously, just use a disk. Microsoft going forward might say, well, just use a Cloud Witness, right? Reality is, if it's just in your same data center, you have no DR on this thing, there's no AG, the disk needs to be small. It can be as small as essentially 512 meg. To your SAN administrators, creating that disk will be no overhead. There's not a lot of I/O going to it. We've all done it for years. I wouldn't worry about this too much. Just do this. Now, if you're using clustered shared volumes in Windows Server 2014, and for those of you that don't know what clustered shared volumes are, it's a new way of deploying an FCI where it's all the storage is attached to all the cluster nodes and is presented. So unlike the traditional FCI where storage is only presented to a single node at a time, it's presented to all of them. Again, outside the scope of this session, but in the same way, because it's still attached disk, I would still do a disk witness for CSV deployments of FCIs in 2014. Now, if you're using SMB or server message block, that's basically file share access for SQL. That was introduced in SQL Server 2012. In that case, I would use a file share witness because I have no locally attached disk. So depending on how you've configured your disk for your FCI, for me, depends on what witness I actually deploy. Because as things have changed in SQL Server, so too do we need to change our thinking about how we've deployed our witness. Now let's look at the AG scenario. Now here's a problem. So when you create a cluster for an AG, where let's say in this case you have standalones, and that's exactly what I'm showing here, by default it's not going to create any witness for you, okay? It's just going to be node majority. So if you're prior to Windows 2012 R2 and you don't have dynamic witness or witness configured, you lose one node, you lose your cluster because you hit 50%. So one thing that you have to do if you have a 2-node AG configuration with standalone instances is you're going to have to configure a witness. And the general recommendation is to use a file share witness. Because again, you have no shared storage. Why would you introduce shared storage when the whole point of doing this is to not have shared storage if this is the configuration you want? Now, can you have combined FCIs plus AGs? Yes. But I'm trying to keep it simple for this slide because a lot of people want this scenario. So the other thing is, much like what I talked about with Cloud Witness, a single file share can be used by multiple Windows clusters. So you don't have to create a file share for every single Windows cluster in the world. If you're going to have, say, FCIs that are using CSV, if you're going to have a bunch of AGs with listener, whatever. One file share, you get a unique GUID for your Windows cluster, and that's that. And one more slide before we get to demos. I want to point out that changing your quorum model or adding a witness or taking away a witness, if that's what you want to do, is completely dynamic. It's not something that you need to take your cluster down to do. If you do, you're doing it wrong or something's wrong with your configuration. I will just say that. Now, the recommendation that I will say, it's not really a recommendation, it's really what you should do. If you're using Windows Server 2012 R2 and you leave the default of dynamic quorum on, which I strongly recommend that you do not disable that, you should always configure a witness and then just let Windows decide whether or not it needs it. All right, so let's have a look at all this stuff. And I know you can't see anything yet, so give me 1 second. All right, so I wonder if this failed. For whatever reason, it didn't. All right. So let me go back here. And so to create this scenario where things were down, basically what I did was I stopped all the services here. So I'm just basically just going to restart. There we go. I'm going to restart everything. And things should come online in a moment. There we go. Things are starting to come online. Excellent, excellent. Oh, didn't want to do that. So let me just start the other nodes. Where would PowerShell go? And this here is running Windows Server 2012 R2. So one thing that I have here that I want to show is I have no witness configured. Now again, that's not recommended. So to change in the GUI your configuration settings, you select the Windows failover cluster, more actions, and then configure cluster quorum settings. So if you're just changing the witness, adding or taking one away, then you would just say select the quorum witness, and in this case, let's say I want to do a file share. So in this case, I have one on my domain controller. Now let me just give you a very quick heads up on that. For my demo purposes to save on VMs, I sometimes will put the file share witness on my domain controller. Don't ever do that in a production environment. Bad mojo. Actually have a real file share that you use. And if your folks don't want to do that, that would be a really bad idea. You also don't want to stick the file share on one of the cluster nodes, because if the cluster node goes down, you lose the file share. So it should be independent of, even if it's the same subnet, on a different server that is hopefully highly available. So that's it. It's just that simple. You'll see now that I have, drumroll please, a file share witness. And what that looks like from a cluster perspective is it shows up here. It's just a resource in the cluster. So if I went out to PowerShell, let me close that, where I'm going to show you some of this stuff. Hopefully that's big enough. So if I did get cluster resource, you'll see here I have a file share witness. Now if I look at the properties of that file share witness, so you'll see this big ID thing, this big GUID, this big nasty long thing, okay? if you're looking at the back end of things, actually, I can do it from here because I should have permissions. So give me a second. Let me open that. So if I go to the file share, see this GUID? Oh. It matches this. So if you're looking on your file share and trying to figure out what actually maps to which cluster, it's the GUID. Now you could obviously, if you wanted to create a folder structure that would have that folder underneath it with a GUID that has a friendly name on top of it, but from a cluster perspective, it just has the GUID. So I just wanted to show you where it derives that from, because eventually somebody's going to come along in your environment and go, I don't understand what this folder is. What is this? And try and blow it away. Bad idea. All right. So if I do a get cluster node, and I look at name, node weight, and dynamic weight. Okay. What we'll see here is that Getty does not have a vote right now. Now, you can also see this visually, although it's not in a necessarily intuitive place. So you have to go to advanced quorum configuration, and to change all of this, like for example, I could remove Neil. And if I go back out here, you notice that Neil went to node weight of 0 and dynamic weight of 0. That's because I removed its vote, so it's not counting against quorum. But you notice that Getty went back up to 1. So, you know, everything's now kind of copacetic, right? So what you'll also notice, for example, I'm going to put Neil back in for a moment. But you can also set it this way. You could say get cluster node Neil dot node weight equals 1. So basically, that's just setting that property. So if I, again, go back and execute this, you'll see he's got a vote. Now, there's a property, what we call cluster common properties, all right? So if I do a get cluster, you'll see there's this thing right here, witness dynamic weight. This is not something that you can configure. In Windows 2012 R2, as long as dynamic quorum is enabled, and I'm not showing you how to disable it, but it's there. You can do it through PowerShell or the GUI, but this witness dynamic weight will have one of two values, 0 or 1. Now notice here we've got 3 nodes, so it doesn't need the witness resource that I configured. Now let me go back up here and take Neil out as a voter and set it to 0. So now if I go back here and look at, just do get cluster witness dynamic weight, you see it has a value of 1. Why is that? Well, I took Neil out as a voter. That kept it odd. Once I took Neil out as a voter, I went to even number of nodes, so it needed the witness. It rolled it in. So this is the cluster automatically managing whether or not you need a witness resource. Now, on top of that, let's say for whatever reason, you didn't configure a witness. And remember, this is Windows Server 2012 R2. So you would not get this behavior on earlier versions of Windows. So if I do set cluster quorum, no witness, it removes it. That, by the way, that's also new syntax in Windows Server 2012 R2. And if I now go execute this again, you'll see something interesting. Notice that Getty was given a 0. This is that tiebreaker functionality that I was talking about. Basically, it says here, okay, I've still got to be odd, and I had 2, and if I lose one thing, I might go down, so it automatically adjusts things. They mainly put this in for multi-site, but as you can see, this is how it works underneath the covers. Now, you can actually pick which node that it is the victim in this case. So if you look at get cluster, never type in a demo. All right, so we've got time. So it's lower quorum. Okay. There's a common property which, quite frankly, if you're looking at it, makes no sense. It's called lower quorum priority node ID. So you basically can set this, and that would be the node that it would take the vote away from. So if I wanted it to be Alex in this case, all I would need to do is say get cluster node, for example, and you see the ID here, and just set lower quorum priority node ID to whatever node you wanted to be that victim. So that is something you can configure. There's no GUI for this. It is just PowerShell, which is why I'm pointing this out. But as you can see, dynamic quorum and dynamic witness just works. It's recalculating things on the fly. Now, one thing that all of this enables, including in Windows Server 2012, is the fact that you can get to what we call last man standing. So prior to Windows Server 2012, if you got to a point where things could tip over or you lost too much, the cluster could go down. However, in a controlled fashion, if you didn't have a bunch of catastrophic failures at the same time, so let's say you had that 4-node cluster, but you lost nodes one by one. Assuming you had the resources to run everything on a single node, you could do that without what's known as forcing quorum and forcing the cluster up. That's only Windows Server 2012 and later. But that also speaks to you need to have the capacity and plan that ahead of time. Now, where that doesn't work is if you have catastrophic failures that exceed those thresholds I talked about, the 49% or the 50%, depending on your OS, within, I think it's like 2 minutes of each other. I think there's an internal thing. I'm not sure what exactly the number is in Windows. But basically, if it's really quick between them, then it may not work. But as long as they're not simultaneous. Now, having said that, if you're having that many failures in your cluster, you've got bigger issues. You know, if you lose 3 of your 4 nodes within the span of about 15 minutes, I'd be really doing a bunch of other stuff right now. The last thing I'd be worried about is if I was getting to last man standing, because at that point, it's probably a matter of time before you lose the last node. So be really careful there. And this is Windows Server 2012 R2. So hopefully that answered your question of you just create one witness for the entire cluster, and then Windows will roll in or roll out as the case may be. And again, that could also be a disk witness here. It doesn't matter. You know, as long as you pick the right witness for your particular use, it will be fine. Okay. Yep, question.
Does SQL 2014 support DFS paths for file share?
So could you say that again?
Does SQL 2014 support DFS paths for file share?
What about sorry, the echo is really bad up here, so.
Sorry. Okay, I'll step back. Does SQL 2014 support DFS paths for file share?
Yeah, so SQL Server 2012 and 2014, you can use, well, for SQL itself, you can use SMB, which is a file share for database storage, right? Mm-hmm. But SQL itself doesn't care what Windows uses behind the scenes for file share for witness, because that's, and I want to make that clear, and I'm sorry if I didn't make that clearer, and I hope this answers your question. If not, come up to me afterwards or in our booth. But SQL itself doesn't care what you configure for witness at the Windows level. You know, it's purely Windows function that helps your SQL servers stay up or your AGs stay up. But from that level, you know, SQL Server can use file share or disk or whatever it needs, but you don't need something separate. Question?
Allan, can you please repeat the meaning of dynamic weight and when does it change for each node?
Okay, so the question is around dynamic weights. So as you saw in this case, where the tiebreaker was involved, I then, it then automatically adjusted it. Now let's look here. So for example, if I go to configure cluster quorum settings and go to advanced quorum configuration, and let's say I put Neil back in, all right, just do this. And then I went back here and looked at all this. So if I powered Neil down right now, okay, for whatever reason, Neil's not available to me, or they're doing maintenance, or they're doing something where they needed to reboot it. If I go execute this, it removed this vote here, but let me actually add, so hold on a second. So set cluster quorum, node and file share majority, HVDC/FSW. Okay, so now if I go and do this, you'll see here that it rolled Neil out. Neil is assigned a weight. I didn't remove it. It just rolled out the dynamic, so the calculation now is based on 2. So when I didn't have the witness before I just added it back in, it was doing the tiebreaker thing going, okay, I'm going to remove it from the other node because I only had 2. It still needs to stay odd. But the second I added the witness back in, I went back to total odd because I had the witness. So then it gave the vote back to Getty in this case. So that's a dynamic thing at work. Now, again, you can't really see some of this prior to Windows Server 2012 R2 in the GUI. What I do want to point out here is that, so Neil is obviously down, and you can see in Failover Cluster Manager this, right? So this part of the GUI is only Windows Server 2012 R2. So all the stuff that I've been showing in PowerShell is the way you would see all this stuff in Windows Server 2008 R2 and Windows Server 2012, although you wouldn't have dynamic in Windows Server 2008 R2. But all that PowerShell works across all versions that I've been showing. Okay. Get back to the deck here. So now let's talk about multi-site, because this is it's essentially the most problematic when we talk about quorum. Kind of like I was saying earlier, in my mind, as somebody who works with customers a lot who do disaster recovery, all of them will say, yeah, I just want it to automatically flip over. I've got a data center in Seattle. I've got one in Chicago. If Seattle goes offline, I want to flip to Chicago automatically. You want to run at that point, because I can tell you things will be screwed up if you let that happen. So when we flip data centers, I always recommend that you do this in a controlled fashion, because think about it. In a 9/11-like scenario where something unplanned and catastrophic happened, and at some point after you get through the human tragedy of it and businesses need to start to come up and running, you know, you don't know where you're at, right? Like, are your databases okay? Are your networks okay? Is your domain up? You bring things up in the wrong way, and things could even get worse. So you want to make sure that when somebody at an executive level makes a decision to turn the switch on for the other site, that all your ducks are lined up and you have the right processes. Because otherwise it may go from bad to worse. I've seen it happen. It's not fun, and I don't recommend it. But the question for context of this talk is, if I've got a clustered configuration, be it geographically dispersed FCI, where I'm using some sort of hardware-based disk mirroring for my storage, or I'm using AGs where SQL Server is the data movement method. What do I do? And this is where things like combining certain features get difficult. This is where things like node weights come in, because, for example, if you have bad networking between your two sites, if you have votes assigned to, say, your DR site, and your DR site has a network blip between the primary site and that, depending on your scenario and the number of nodes, your entire cluster could go down because you lost connectivity to your DR site. So do you remove node votes from your DR site, for example? All right. If you talk to Microsoft, and specifically the Windows guys, this is what they're going to recommend for you. Is because all of you, had deep pockets and are large companies, so they think that you've got at least 3 data centers and you can stick a file share witness somewhere else. Now, my customers, not so much. Now, we do have a couple that have situations like this, but by and large, most companies have a single data center, maybe 2, but not 3+, right? So then you could say, well, could I put this up in Azure like this? Not the blob thing that I talked about, but could I put some sort of file share witness up in Azure? Sure. But that also means you now need to have site-to-site VPN and a bunch of complex stuff in place. File share witness is, especially when you're going multi-site, is not a straightforward thing because both sides have to have access to this. Another option would be what's called asymmetric witness. So sort of to your scenario earlier with the question that you asked about disk-only quorum. Here's where, let's say you have an AG deployment of 4 nodes. You have an FCI in site A and an FCI in site B. And you have an availability group that spans them. There's no traditional disk-based replication happening here. Well, at that point, if you're not going to configure a file share witness, and we'll talk about cloud in a second, but if you're not going to create a file share witness and you have disk, at that point you're saying to yourself, well, I could create a disk-based witness, but I'm going to have to put it in one site or the other because you're not replicating storage. At that point, it's like having almost like a local 2-node FCI configuration, but not really because you have this all as part of an AG mix. So what I recommend people do is this. Now, when I say witness not active here, and let me zoom in on this picture real quick, what I mean here is you create another disk resource that is seen by the other side, so that if you have to flip over to the second site, the resource that you'll use as a disk witness is already there. There's no replication involved of any disk stuff, so that if you have to configure a witness, it's already there and ready to go. Because the reality is, replicating at a storage level is very expensive, especially for something like quorum, which is roughly incidental. You've already got 2 SANs, why overcomplicate things? The other one, obviously, which at this point, starting with vNext, that would be the optimal, would be to use that cloud witness I showed earlier. But this fails if your servers do not have internet connectivity. If you're using just all internal behind firewalls where you don't access the internet, and I have plenty of customers who have servers in these situations where not everything is internet connected. At that point, you're looking at asymmetric disk witness, or potentially asymmetric file share witness, or a file share that's in a third site. There's no magic bullet for quorum in multi-site. It's what's the easiest to maintain for you, it's what's going to be easiest to configure, and that's really it. There's no magic secret sauce. Now, one question that I get quite often is, okay, so can I use another node essentially as witness? The answer there is yes, but here's my issue with that. That means you now have another license to Windows. It's just another server you need to maintain, and if it's literally just sitting there as a witness, sure, you can make this a really small VM somewhere, right? That means it's part of the same cluster, so now you have a 5-node cluster, not a 4-node cluster. There's all these dependencies that now come along with having a node essentially as witness. I don't recommend this. Now, if this is all you want to handle because you don't want to put up a file share, it works. But not something I would do as a first option, this would be pretty much my option of last resort if I couldn't use anything else. But the reason I put it in here is that it is actually a valid quorum option to give you that odd number of votes. You know, it's a bit out there, but it is what it is. Well, so the comment was, you know, you could put up like a Windows XP machine with a file share. You know, reality is you can put up a file share almost anywhere, right? Like, almost anything is better than putting up a whole other node that you got to get in the cluster to do this. All right. One of the last things I'm going to talk to you about here is forcing quorum. Now, forcing quorum is something that you should practice, something that you should know about, but nothing you should really ever have to do on an often basis. Because here's what it is. Let's say you do lose quorum or your cluster goes down and doesn't come back up easily. What forcing quorum does is basically you say, okay, I'm going to pick a node and I'm going to basically force that cluster online at the Windows level. And then that will bring the resources online in the cluster. Now, you'll see depending on how you have things set up, you can do it through a GUI, you can do it through PowerShell, you can do it through a normal DOS prompt with the net start cluster service with the option FQ, or you could type it out and say force quorum, one of the two. Doesn't really matter. But your cluster is going to be in a special state, and at that point, if you really screw things up, you could lose everything in your cluster. Because basically what you're saying at that point is, I've made the decision to run on a single node, not through last man standing, but literally my cluster was down. I want to get back up and running. So the quickest way to that is forcing this thing online. But until I get other things online, if that thing goes down, I can lose almost everything. So be very careful about doing things like forcing quorum. And really, this should be something that you think about you do. This is not something that you should do as a matter of course. When you hit this point and you're forcing quorum, you're in a really bad place. I want to make that very clear. If this is your option, this is almost your Hail Mary. Now, one thing that I want to make also very crystal clear, only use the force quorum on a single node. Because if you, let's say, have a network issue where two nodes or two sites can't see each other, and you force quorum on both nodes or in both sites, that's when you have split brain. And in a couple slides, I'm going to show you why that's really bad for SQL Server. Now, what you should do, I think this is in Windows Server 2008 R2, but I know it's in 2012 and 2012 R2, is use what's known as prevent quorum. So for all other nodes except that first, when you bring them online and force them online, use prevent quorum. Or you can use prevent quorum first for those other nodes and then run force quorum on the main node last. Because what prevent quorum does is it prevents those other nodes from actually forming the cluster until you have one node that's essentially going to be the authoritative one. So again, this is something that you should be aware of. This is something that as a DBA you may never do, but you should be aware of it. And if it is your responsibility or whoever's responsibility is in your organization, they should be testing this. Now, this is something that's very easy to test in like a VM environment to test this process. Now, what exactly is split brain? Basically, like I said, it's a partitioned Windows failover cluster. Two things think they own all the resources and have the master cluster configuration. So let's assume in this case you have either an AG listener or an FCI or just AG, whatever you've got. And you're running in one site and everything's honky-dory. Whether, again, you're using disk-based replication for an FCI scenario or using AGs for data movement in SQL Server. You lose connectivity between your sites. Cluster goes down. Now, at this point, you have a choice. You can wait to see if things come up, your network comes back up, or at some point, you probably have a go, no-go point that says, we probably need to do something. And that's the point where somebody makes a decision, let's force quorum. But unfortunately, let's say in this case, somebody doesn't talk to somebody else at the other side, and two people at the same time decide to force quorum on each side. Both sides think they are the cluster. Welcome to forced quorum. This is really bad, and you're going to see why in a second. So let's say your clients, your applications, whatever, obviously need to do some sort of name resolution. Depending on where the client or the server is coming in from and where your DNS is, read-write inserts, updates, and deletes could be routed to one of the two sides. So you could have inserts, updates, and deletes happening on both sides simultaneously in what they think is the same database, when in reality, it's two separate instances of SQL Server with two separate databases that will now be completely out of sync. Because we all know how easy it is to get data that's not the same, especially out of vendor applications, and now munge them into one. Basically, at this point, you're not in a happy place. If you can recover from this, more power to you. But bottom line here is this is why you want to prevent split brain. But on the flip side, here's the deal. This is a man-made problem. This is not something that could happen automatically. So if you have the right processes in place, there's no way that split brain could happen. So the takeaway for split brain is it something you need to worry about? Absolutely. Is it something that you should worry about insanely? No. But it's something that you need to plan for and something that you need to wrap your processes around to ensure that it doesn't happen. And again, this is everything I've talked about today, as you saw, affects SQL Server, but has really, to a large degree, nothing to do with SQL Server because it's all Windows. So you guys may have no input into this process as it happens, but you should have some say as to when it would happen. Because again, you may not pull the trigger, but you need to know if somebody's going to be forcing quorum, because for example, at that point, you may need to manually kick the tires on your availability group. You may need to manually restart it and may have some decisions that go along with that. FCI should generally just restart, but around things like availability groups, you may have some decisions to make. For example, if you force your AG up on an asynchronous node, at that point, you're, for the most part, going to accept some potential data loss. And then you have to make some decisions around, okay, if my site B is going to be my new primary site, when I bring up site A, how am I going to handle that in terms of my availability group? That's what I'm saying. While this is a process that is largely Windows, it affects what you're going to have to decide to do in certain SQL scenarios. Okay. I'm going to do a summary because we've only got about 5 minutes left, and I'm going to open the floor to questions. So, first and foremost, cluster down or quorum down, SQL down. This is why you architect redundancy into your platform. You always want to have the number of voters odd. Now, where you would do things like remove a vote, like I said, if something is purely read-only, or you have, say, bad connectivity to your DR site, and I showed you how all the dynamic stuff works in 2012 and 2012 R2, it works really well. It helps you manage what you actually care about in terms of what you want to maintain for quorum. Said it a couple times, but I do recommend using Windows 2012 R2. You do need to monitor, even if it is dynamic, because you need to know if you're in the right quorum state or not. So as you saw through all the PowerShell, that stuff is really easy to get at. Now the problem, though, unfortunately, as you kind of saw, there's no roll-up summary number that says, the cluster sees 3 total voters. You kind of have to put that together yourself. As I mentioned a few times as well, just having the disk-only quorum is not only not recommended, pretty much I would tell you forget it exists. And if it does exist in your configurations, I would just change them to node plus disk witness. It's very simple. It's online. It's a change. It's not going to make a big difference. And as I said with split brain, not something that you need to insanely worry about, but something that you do need to plan for. So with the last couple minutes, I'm going to open up for questions.
With regards to split brain, so let's say that you have and availability group. Yeah, thanks for going back to that. So
Yep.
let's say site A is an availability group, site B is an availability group, and for some reason, you know, you force quorum and you have that split brain.
Yep.
Assuming that someone was clever enough to put a listener on there, how would that interact with those two nodes? Because now you have two nodes up and the application's going to the listener, not to the individual node.
Right, so that's why here, and that basically the question is, if I have a listener in this mix, what happens? So that's why I had that sort of data movement there, because if you're using a listener, listener has an entry in DNS. So that's where I was saying it could do inserts, updates, and deletes on both sides if you do split brain. So for example, in your availability group configuration, this is one reason why you may not actually want to use a listener. Because I know one or two folks who have AG configurations who do not use a listener, because if they get into a split brain scenario and they get into something like this and hit the wrong DNS, it could get inserted everywhere. They actually connect directly to the instance and don't use things like read-only routing in the listener to avoid this situation. So again, this can impact your overall architecture. Now, the unfortunate thing there is that with the availability group listener, it's one of the biggest benefits of availability groups, because it abstracts where things are running behind the scenes. However, in the split brain scenario, the listener can become a liability. So this is why, again, with split brain, you need to make sure there's communication between whoever is working both sites, and that you only force it up on one site, not two. Because like I said, this is a man-made scenario. This is not something the cluster will bring on itself.
Allan, you mentioned that regarding DR, you need to practice it, but not do it automatically. Do you have some recommendations about how to practice it regarding both application and the SQL Server side?
Yeah, so I was going to show you a demo of forcing quorum, but that's one of my VMs that decided literally 5 minutes before not to really work, but I'll show you this a little bit. So I've got this all set up in VMs. So I've literally got sorry, no, sorry, can't see it. Give me a second here. So I've got here, let me run zoom it real quick for you. Come on. Okay. So I've got in my VMs here true multi-subnet. So I've got two DCs. I've got a router. So I'm running multiple subnets. Now, again, my one VM failed this morning, and things are partially on. Yeah. But basically what I've got here is that scenario. So I'll run through it just really quickly. So if I basically, let's say, more actions, configure cluster quorum settings. So in this case, George and Ringo are out of voting contention, okay? Which are my two bottom ones here. So in essence, that this failed kind of doesn't matter. Now, if I powered these nodes down, okay, that's basically simulating or I could have pulled the virtual NICs, doesn't matter. This cluster is going to go down because I just simulated a complete site failure, right? So a big part of this is making sure that you can simulate the networking for multi-subnet. So once you can set that up, then you can kind of start playing with this, right? So wait till this logs in, and what I will do here is I will force this online, if it ever comes up. I said, this literally worked at about 4 in the morning. I tested about 7 in the morning, and VMware decided to say, hey, I don't like you this.
Welcome back. It's Friday morning and we're live again here in sunny Seattle. That's right, it never rains. And I'm joined this morning by two people from the past board. Super busy this week and it's awesome that we've got their time. Amy and JRJ, welcome to the set.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about what you guys have been doing this week. I know it's been a busy week for you guys.
Oh, it has been a crazy week, but it's been a wonderful week. So happy Friday, everybody. We have some great sessions lined up today, and we've had them all this week. We've had about 206 sessions during the week. We've got Grant Fritchie on the schedule for today, Tim Mitchell, Gail Shaw for people to see at home.
Really cool. I mean, there's a lot going on. Obviously, it's Friday, and everybody thinks, oh man, it's almost the end of the conference, but that doesn't mean it slows down at all today,
Oh, not at all. We have quite a few sessions today. Not having a keynote on Friday gave us the ability to have 16 more sessions in the morning.
Awesome.
So everyone's busy around going to various sessions, so it's been fantastic.
It's been super busy, and I know, not having a keynote, everybody rushes in to try to find those 16 extra sessions as well. It's really cool to see sort of the dynamics on, on a day like today. And speaking of dynamics, JRJ, tell us about the dynamics that you create on the board of directors. What do you do?
So for me, I've been working historically around global growth. Moving forward, we're going to be doing a lot of stuff with our partners, especially those who are in our alliance program. So that's at the moment, that's Dell Software, that's SQL Sentry, that's Hortonworks, and yeah, so that's a great initiative that we